So the title of the talk, Bricks and Mortar and Acquisitions, none of us understood the topic, so you probably don't really understand at least the acquisition part of the topic. So we're going to sort of interpret this in our own way, a little bit about the role of the art gallery, and we'll get started in a second. I just wanted each of my colleagues here to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get to a sort of unusual process that we're going to attempt this time around. So, ladies first, Janice.
Okay, my name's Janice Guy, and I just very recently closed my existing gallery. I had the gallery Murray Guy for almost 20 years, and another gallery before that for 3 years in my apartment. And I have also worked in various galleries. I began as an artist, and I think I've always used the gallery as another artistic expression apart from my own work.
Anthony?
Hi, well, I had a gallery, I still have a gallery, but I had a physical gallery for 35 years. And 2 years ago, I decided I was going to try a different way of doing it. So I still have the gallery, but it doesn't have a physical space. I still represent the number of artists that I always represented, and I still do shows, but I don't do the shows in my own space. But we'll find out more about that as we go on.
So before I get into the structure of how we're going to do this, it helps us to understand a little bit who we're speaking to. So if you have a gallery or you're an art dealer, if you could raise your hand, that would be helpful. Okay, so this talk will be very useful for you, I think. If you're an artist, show of hands. Okay, still useful. Art collector. Okay, less useful, maybe this. Art critic, you guys don't count anyways, but if there are any art critics here, raise your hand. Okay, sorry. So what we're going to try to do here is that, as I'm also someone who had a gallery for a long time but closed over 20 years ago, is instead of talking generically in this topic that's gotten a lot of attention the last few years about successful galleries that are closing or redoing what they're doing, whether it's Andrea Rosen or Lisa Cooley or Nicole Clack's run, and just sort of talking that general thing. What I wanted to do was to look to Janice and say, let's talk through, in fact, what you're going through and what it means. I've went through this a long time ago. Anthony has done this recently, and almost more as a case study, as if three friends were sitting there having dinner and you just said you're closing the gallery. So my first question for you would be, is this more of a emotional decision or a financial decision?
Well, I think it's certainly a financial decision to start with. The emotional side came a little bit afterwards, but yeah, definitely financial. The emotional side, I think that just the realizing that the model of gallery that I was running was not so viable anymore financially, made me want to rethink it. I'm still rethinking the gallery. My lease was ending, so that was a way to end that project and then think about starting new projects.
And Anthony, the same question for you.
All those things apply, but it was a much more sort of positive decision to actually cut at that point. I mean, yes, my lease ended, and yes, the rent was going to be treble the amount it was before, so it was discouraging. But I decided not to repeat the experience, but to actually try a completely different model. And it's not about not having space, but it's about offering more and different space in different contexts. If you have a gallery in one space and you've had it for a very long time, and you've had those artists for a very long time, they've done enough shows in that space. And you can work with them on other spaces and think and find the right context for their work in other countries as well.
So Janice, is your next phase, the decision-making that you're going to go through, is that going to be a financial decision or an emotional decision?
It's going to be an emotional decision, but obviously, the finances are important too. I've been looking very much at Anthony and what he's been doing, and many times people ask me, why don't you, instead of taking a permanent space, just have a pop-up gallery when you have a project that you want to show? And I really don't like this idea of just finding some old empty space, because I've always felt that with the gallery, it was a more intimate experience of people, viewers, coming to see a particular show in my space.
So you're trying to figure out a way to provide emotional experiences, not so much for you or not so much for your artists, but for the public. Is that a public of artists, a public of collectors? I mean, you're giving an emotional answer, which I think is helpful. Who are you trying to satisfy in that emotional way? You first, your public, or the artists?
All of the above.
Pretty hard, okay. Anthony?
I mean, I'm trying to capitalize on what there is available. I mean, I don't think I could do it the way I'm doing it if I hadn't been running for 30 years or more, because I've established so many strong relationships with colleagues who have galleries who are interested in collaborating. But it's about capitalizing on one's resources and their resources, and it's about a mutual benefit. We can share. I can bring an artist into a gallery, bring the whole show into a gallery, and I can bring my clients into the gallery, and their clients can come into my gallery, which is hosted by their gallery, and so on and so forth.
But with somebody with 22 years of being a reformed gallerist, I mean, I had to close for financial reasons, but the emotional adjustment for me was the best benefit of not having to deal emotionally with a stable, bad term, but the one we use, of 10 to 20 artists solely dependent upon me, and allowing, so emotionally is better emotionally for me to stop that, maybe not emotionally for them. So that's why I'm focusing on, are you still, because it's so fresh, artist, artist, artist? At what point does your own ego and your life, we're not 25, life choices, has that entered your mind yet?
Well, of course, the minute I did, let me say that I didn't actually intend to close the gallery. I was going to look for another space. But there were a lot of factors that came together, not excluding the political state of the world today, which made everything seem very insecure. But then when I decided I would close the gallery and take a break and rethink what I wanted to do and then do something, then I realized this moment of not being responsible for this group of people. It was a kind of liberation. Nevertheless, I'm still absolutely dedicated to the artists I work with, and whatever way that I can continue working with them, which could be, as in Anthony's model, collaborating with other galleries. It's something I've already done. I've been hosted by a gallery in London with a show of one of my artists. It was a very, very positive experience. It's something that I would very, very much like to repeat. And continuing maybe to work on with a smaller kind of space where I could still present works as an exhibition, not just as a showroom, but that it would be a very, very different experience from, let's say, going into a large gallery and seeing a big show. So the artists that I've been working with, should they want to work with a larger gallery, should I not have the kind of structure that they need to support them, there may still be ways that I can be working with them.
In a similar way, Anthony, do you have the same relationships with your artist as the Anthony Reynolds Gallery, but no mortar, or how has that changed for you, if at all, or for them?
Changed surprisingly little. I mean, the thing I need to keep re-emphasizing is I have not closed the gallery. I have removed myself from one space and made myself and my artists available for a lot of other spaces in any country at any time. I mean, I've done 2 shows simultaneously in 2 separate countries, for example, which I couldn't have done before.
But how's that different than representing an artist and arranging a show in Tokyo, or you have a physical gallery in London and arranging a show in New York, you were doing that
You can-
as part of your normal
but then-
operation. This is different, you're saying, in some way.
It's different. I mean, in fact, to the extent that the second one I did, for example, in Barcelona, they actually advertised it as gallery in residence. And, you know, and I was there a lot during the show. The very first one I did, which was in London, actually, we actually took over the gallery space and ran it as our gallery for the period of the show. Basically, I'm proposing packages which are, you know, a whole show. I'm not saying, do you want to show my artist? I'm saying I want to show my artist with you, and I'm going to do the show, and I'm going to curate the show, and I'm going to bring it in, and we're going to share the costs, and then we're going to share the proceeds.
Okay, I'm having a hard time getting my hands around it, because you could do that in London. You did that in London every day for 20-something years, except that partner with the other person was yourself, right?
Yeah, but now I have opportunities to do the same thing, if you like, but in many different places, and I can look for and research the places or the programs that would most benefit my artist, and which artist would most benefit the host gallery. For example, if you stick with the one in Barcelona, which was a Gallery Angels in Barcelona, which is a really good gallery, but very conceptually orientated and very performance and media and film orientated. They'd never shown a painter. So I brought a painter in, just, you know, because they were excited to see what would happen. And I thought that this painter would really appeal to a Spanish painterly sensibility. And my God, it did. It went down a bomb.
So Janice, does that model appeal to you to say, well, basically I'm doing the same thing I always did, just shifting it without this triple the rent situation, or London being a particularly specific place? Do you hear that and say, yes, that's what I should do because I love the artists that I work with and I like to expose them? Or is that, why wouldn't that be good for you? Or
It would be good for me.
So
It's
are we
something-
done? Is that what you're going to do?
Well, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm taking this period of time to consider different things, and actually having this conversation and talking with Anthony has been very, very useful for me. But this is a model that I find very, very interesting.
And what happened to you? Again, we're trying to create this sort of case study of Anthony to apply to Janice. Did you have some things happen that surprised you for the better and also surprised you for the worse? That in this morphing of Anthony Reynolds Gallery to Anthony Reynolds Gallery
Well, I was
version 2?
was surprised the extent to which it was embraced by my colleagues. I mean, I hoped it would be, and obviously I have many good friends in the business, but I was surprised, I mean, how many people are approaching me to ask me if I want to do a project with them.
If I might just, it's surprised me as well how many people have asked me to curate shows in their spaces. I find that something a little bit different, and I actually find what Anthony's doing more interesting, that it would be then my gallery being hosted rather than me being the curator of a show.
Any negative consequences that you can,
Too early to tell.
any that you're worried about of consequences? And in the meantime, all the artists you're working with decide they want more traditional situations.
I mean, I can imagine, you know, I mean, an artist might expect a sort of regular show. If I can keep up the regular show, but in more interesting contexts, then they're happy. If it means that I suddenly find, I can imagine what could happen is that one artist becomes very popular for such projects, and I'm doing lots of shows by the same artist. That could be a negative factor, even though it's very positive for a particular artist.
Well, one negative consequence is your commissions have decreased because you're sharing every commission.
Yeah,
Right.
but that costs. I mean,
And
it's for mutual benefit. You know, we share the transport costs, the production costs, whatever costs, and
Not the rent, and not the staff.
No, but I have staff.
Has your staff size changed?
No, I've always had very small staff. It's gone down by half of one.
How big is your staff?
It's me plus two.
You plus two, and you going from
Mine was me plus me and my partner in the gallery plus 2 employees.
And my
So-
staff work at home. The whole gallery's in the cloud. We meet once a week at a hotel.
well, imagining that a gallery at the scale of, say, Andrea Rosen, probably at 20, if she went from 20 to 4, that's significant change, but also change of services. So you're able to do this because you were already smaller and more nimble as it was. So it's a model that might work. Do you find you work more time or less time, or the same?
I work more.
Yeah.
Yeah, I work more.
At the moment, I'm working more too.
So
I travel more
counterintuitive.
too.
So the idea of sitting in your gallery waiting for Mr. Big to walk in the door was probably an old broken model, isn't it?
Yeah.
Mrs.
but
Big,
This
sorry.
is the side of it that is quite and very relevant to us being here is if you don't have a space yourself outside of the shows, how are you going to show your work to clients? And of course, art fairs become rather important, and art fairs aren't necessarily traditionally interested in galleries that don't have spaces.
If
But
you
it's
read yesterday's
changing.
art newspaper that talks about this subject and featured Anthony at the discussion that the fair is having is might they see a time where having a physical exhibition program is not a necessary component for the exhibitors?
No, the exhibition program needs to be the exhibition space doesn't need. Why should it be fixed?
Well, I think they're probably in most cases combining those terms. You could have an exhibition space without an exhibition program. People do.
You could indeed.
So I think they're asking or will be asking the questions, how do they need to define the exhibitors here? Do you worry that you can't get a booth at an art fair because you've got this new structure that you may have? Or do you worry about your ability to show at Basel or Frieze or?
Well, I did Basel for 23 years in a row. And when I closed the doors of the space, they said verbally that I wasn't eligible. They didn't say it in writing, and put me on the waiting list, which I knew would happen. But it's interesting that, I mean, things change and they're rethinking all the time. But other fairs don't necessarily have that restriction. And I treat fairs like another alternative gallery space. So I do one-man solo shows in fairs, and I do the fairs that I think are interesting for that artist or that context. So, for example, in Artissima in Turin, they have this section called Back to the Future. Well, I have several artists who fit nicely into that category, and they're very happy to have me. And I've done 3 solo shows in a row there.
But if your business model requires this week of June, this decision could have severe consequences, at least in the short term. I can only imagine how many artists are feeling in their studios, I want my gallery to be showing in Basel. That shows my friends that I'm at a top gallery because they're in Basel, whether it's in the main booth, their statements, and they're going to want to be represented in a gallery with walls or not by people who show at X, Y, or Z. And
I think there are a lot of artists who are actually not concerned with that very much. I think it's, the galleries maybe have their work on their booths and they're selling their work, but I think there are many artists who are very much concerned about having exhibitions rather than having their work on a booth in art fairs.
I think there's millions of artists, so I think
It's a bit of everything.
it's a different
No, I
kind of
take
thing
your
when you're
point.
making a decision based. We're both talking just about the two of you, but we're also trying
Yeah,
to
sure.
generalize for the people watching. So I think the answer is the type of artists that you're working with have to have an emotional or physical needs that are met by this kind of existence. And for those of them that are more plastic art in the sense of painting and sculpture.
Yeah. I'm not
may
against other
require that.
galleries showing my artists at art fairs. I'm not against. And the other thing about this sort of collaborative approach is that there's actually much more flexibility and much less paranoia about losing your artists because you're working together.
Well, the battle always for the galleries is that their successes can get too great to where artists want either, I mean, it's true, they often just want a different physical environment so the work looks different, but they, as Jenny Holzer used to say, protect me from what I want. And that's a natural.
Yeah, but if I was starting a gallery now, I would say to a young artist who I was taking on that it's my job to lose you.
That's a good one. Everybody write that one down.
And the other thing I would say is that one should remember that the artists are your clients rather than the collectors.
Something very interesting.
Well, it's an interesting thing because if you don't live in New York or London, you can't really say that in the same way as if you're in Stuttgart and you get 3 works every 4 years from your artist. Your clients are your clients more than your
They're
artists.
both clients, but the people you're representing are your artists.
You should be, but if you're not the main representative of them, and you're only, because we have this global system going on, and a lot of galleries that aren't in the media centers or the financial centers, and they're in San Francisco or they're in Milan, they may only get 1 work a year from that artist. It's a more complex situation than we New York and Londoners think of ourselves.
It's an easy soundbite, I agree, but I think there's a lot of truth in it.
He was sort of agreeing with me without disagreeing with himself. Is that about right?
Yeah,
Okay,
sure.
Good.
I think, not to quibble about these terms, but I think that Anthony's right that, the artists are our clients, and even if you are not the main gallery or not the gallery where the artist lives and you get 1 piece every now and again, you're still working for the artist. And as their representative, as their agent, whatever you want to call it, so the artists remain clients as well.
Well, I have 25 years of working on the other side, working for collectors and clients and occasionally museum. So I'm a little less Pollyanna. I'm going to tell you that if you're in Chicago and you have a client who comes in twice a week for 8 years in a row, they're more your client than that artist who gives you 1 work every 3 years.
You're absolutely right.
And if you want to have us all, that we are the world feeling good thing.
I was talking about being the main gallery and representing an artist.
And that's a distinction that's different. And having that responsibility, that's why I come back to this emotional thing, is such an incredible burden, but necessity and an important factor of what one is doing, rather than just showing art and selling art. What I do is not very important. What you guys were doing was much more important. So are you concerned that what you're going to do is as important? Janice?
more important, what's less important. I think we have to decide on what our priorities are and follow those. I don't quite understand the word importance in this context.
I think you're going to have to figure out at some point what's most important for you personally and what's important to the people around you. And my experience is going to tell you that stepping back for a little bit and really addressing that question will be essential to before you jump in and quite rightly don't open pop-up galleries or start curating shows, is to really take, let's say, the summer to look there into yourself, because it's a really huge responsibility what you're doing, Anthony, and what you've done for all these years.
Yeah, and I think it's important not to be too rigid. I'm not totally against the idea of doing a pop-up occasionally. In fact, I'm planning a really huge pop-up right now. But I mean, if you can keep lively and keep things going and keep negotiating with galleries and widening. I mean, I've had offers from people in Tehran to do shows. You know, I mean, it's been extraordinarily invigorating and exciting, and the potential is enormous. I'm not sure I'm young enough to fulfill this potential, but it's quite extraordinary.
I think the reason, you know, it's changed so much. The reason for opening a gallery now feels different. You know, you grow up as a kid and your parents see in the Wall Street Journal that somebody bought a painting for $100 million, and you can go to art school and get a degree, and it seems like a proper bourgeois job that people think, hey, that's going to be fun. I'm going to go to Basel, and then we're in Venice. I'm going to have dinner for 200 there, and, you know, I'm going to be around art. But the reason for opening a gallery is I have this art that I feel compelled to be a voice for and to show. And the reason for doing a show is not like, oh shit, it's December, I have to put on an exhibition. I got the doors open. Let's do a show because you have an idea of a show to do, not just because somebody says, hey, here's the time, here's the space. You know, when you have something to say it and find the way to do it.
Yeah.
So that's my advice for you.
No, it's very good advice. It's very good advice.
What would you ask Anthony for advice?
Well, Anthony, as I said, Anthony's been quite an inspiration in these conversations that we've been having about having this conversation, or pre-conversations. I've started thinking about a lot of things that I hadn't thought about before, and I think that one of the things that would excite me is this fact of not being so based in one place, based in New York, having the possibility of operating in different parts of the world.
As a personal reason or as a artistic reason?
I think both. Definitely both. I mean, the artistic reason would come first, and the personal reason is then to enjoy my life a little bit more.
We have 10 more minutes, so I think it'd be a good point to maybe open the floor to questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring the mic. And if you can say something like, I'm an artist, I'm a collector, I got lost, front row. We'll work our way back.
Hi, Katerina, actually, for context, worked with Josh a little bit at eBay. So my question is going to be appropriately about online sales. So my question is, since Anthony, you were saying that, you know, a lot of your stuff is in the cloud and a lot of your work is done remotely, have you thought about moving some of your work online and trying that as sort of a pop-up? And actually, that's a question, both of you. Is that an avenue you're willing to explore?
You know, one's told one should explore all these avenues. I must say that online activity has been, you know, very lively in terms of information, but is nearly always dodo as far as an actual sale is concerned. And I'm not against the idea of doing a show online. You're talking about that, using it as a space, as a virtual physical space. I think that's certainly a possibility.
I think that the online sales, I still feel that I need the relationship both with the artist and the client. And we make a lot of sales through, we've made a lot of sales through people checking out things on our website and getting in touch with us. But it was never that it was just something that was up for sale online. I've never really
I
explored
mean, one
the
gets
whole-
constant emails forwarded from ArtNet or Artsy or somewhere saying so-and-so is interested in such and such a work, which I got from your website. And it's nearly always somebody who thinks it's going to cost 100 quid.
We have a... Go back that way. There was a hand up before, or whoever.
Janice, you mentioned something about wanting to have a kind of international presence and working internationally. And I thought about, I don't know if this might sound silly, but would you be open to working with corporations like Burger King or McDonald's as like a space to do exhibitions and shows, because they have a very strong international presence?
Work for food?
I think that the context of where the work goes, the work itself determines the context. So I would not normally think Burger King or McDonald's, but there may be an exhibition where that is exactly the place where it should be. Getting back to talking about pop-up galleries, again, the idea of pop-up galleries, I immediately think of a space that happens to be empty, and so one takes that space. But finding spaces to do shows, finding a certain kind of, maybe a space that is not at all like a gallery, that it could be some space that existed as something else in the past and still has it. It could have been a bank, it could have been a church. Those are the first things that come to mind. So why not a gallery? It's a show in McDonald's if that's what the work needs, but only then.
Another question?
Hi. You mentioned that the traditional model is not viable anymore. Do you think that there's potential to sort that out with perhaps the artists take the 50-50 commission changing or production being shifted in some way? Because I feel like artists are probably always still going to want, there's always going to be galleries that can do all the art fairs and have spaces all over the world now. So, and somehow there's got to be some way of being able to have a gallery and do the art fairs, but make it a viable model.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I didn't say it wasn't viable. I mean, it's certainly tough, but I mean, like the rest of society these days, the extreme is very great between those that have not, or those are big, those are small, and most of the interesting stuff that's been made by artists is in the middle, and it's a much tougher area, but it doesn't mean it's not viable, and depends how good you are at it, I guess. But as far as I was concerned, it wasn't about viability, it was about wanting to do something else.
Take a shot at it before I respond.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the part of your question where you're talking about artists maybe coming to a different kind of terms or agreements. Is that what you were mentioning? I don't think that the actual the 50-50 split that I think most people do, even though not everybody does that. There are certainly artists that get to a certain stature where they expect more. But I think that generally, I'm just going to say this as an aside, that very often artists don't even know what we do. And I think that we have been ending up, I don't know, Anthony's been in it longer than me, even though I've been around for a long time. We end up doing more and more and more in ways of production and storage and providing all of this for the artists, which makes it more difficult for us. Those are the kind of things that possibly one could change. We were talking about this earlier, about actually dividing those costs 50-50. But it really boils down to this middle area having a lot of difficulties. And
the problem, I'm going to say, is that I think the stat in America was that 50% of the major one-person exhibitions came from 6 galleries. So the challenge is the museum's challenge, and the challenge is if you're not one of those 6 of Gagosians, Werner, Hasselworth, that's half the shows. It's like that's an issue that's sort of related to this zone of everybody else.
But that's also because the galleries are now the museums are expecting the galleries to be supporting their shows, paying for the shipping, paying for the catalogue, which of course puts a lot of this middle area of galleries, they can't compete with that kind of thing. I worry about what's going to happen to culture, because the artists that are showing in these big galleries, they don't just find them in the studio. They come from being nurtured by a certain other kind of gallery. And if those other galleries then disappear because they can't survive in this climate, then it really worries me what is going to happen to culture in general.
But I bet if we looked at the first Art Basel and the gallery list there's probably 3 of them that are still here. Or you go back
First
10 years.
Art Basel was a long time ago.
Okay, so if we go back, I mean, I'm going to say galleries opening and closing is not a new phenomenon. We're talking about it more than recently.
There's more galleries now, so obviously galleries closing, that the numbers are bigger proportionately, but they're not proportionately. They're
There are
bigger.
more galleries because it's more viable.
Another question? Second row front.
Thank you. Thinking of the buyer and the artist as a stakeholders for the gallery, as you all have made the decision to close your gallery, how have you communicated out that decision to these 2 stakeholders, and what on balance has been the response from these 2 groups of stakeholders?
I'll say for Anthony, again, he didn't close the gallery, he just changed.
Sorry, sure, same thing. Question.
And I did close the gallery. I mean, I closed my company, and I'm going to be working as another kind of entity. How was the reaction from the artists and the collectors? I think a lot of people were very sad. What more can I say? They expressed that widely. And a lot of the artists are very worried that there might not be a gallery like my gallery that they can work with. So I'm hoping that I can continue working with the galleries in whatever capacity that I can. The collectors, a lot of them were very, very sad I was closing the gallery, even though many of them were people that weren't supporting me.
You didn't realize you had so many fans till afterwards. At least that's
Exactly.
it's like, where were you before you started saying how wonderful you were? Anthony? So nothing's changed for you. You're still
no,
wonderful.
But of course, we've broadcast the fact of what we changed, how we changed, and still trying to change the website and make new decisions about it every week, and it's been in limbo for far too long. But we make, we have huge mailing lists and all sorts of ways of contacting people. I mean, obviously the artists were fully informed about everything from the word go, and no rebellions yet.
We have time for one more question. So who has the best question? Who's got the second best question? Oh, you have the best question. Okay, we'll give you top 3.
I'm a private dealer. I was wondering while I was listening to you how the artist's work might change over the next few years, because I'm sure they're sitting in the studio and they're thinking, okay, my next show at the gallery, oh, I hang this on this wall and this on that wall, ceiling height is such and such. How might that impact their work going forward if they don't have that brick and mortar gallery that they're used to?
I think that's exactly one of the disadvantages that emerges over time, is that artists find themselves making things, for a gallery or for a fair. I mean, obviously, there can be thematic reasons why something should be made for something, but in general, the artist should make what they want to make, and you should find the best way of contextualizing that for them.
Artists, obviously, when they're working on a show, they are working, thinking about the space. And I'm talking about living artists now. So, they're preparing their next show and they know what kind of space it's going to be. But, with a different kind of model, and the kind of model that Anthony has, the one that interests me, which is that, we collaborate with other galleries, they're still going to know in advance what the architecture of the gallery space is going to be, and then not necessarily making the work to fit the walls, so to speak, but they then are working with that architecture. I think that artists do that all the time, and whether they're showing in the same gallery all the time or different galleries, they're always confronting the space that they're in.
I think a wise woman once said, when a door closes, a window opens. And I think a wise man said, when a window closes, a door opens. And so for the artist, that's good, that now they have to think out of the white cube, perhaps. And I'm hoping for both Janice and Anthony, as doors closed, that whole windows open, and that's a good thing for them, for their artists, and I hope for this room. So thank you. If you have one final remark, now's the time. If not, our time is up.
When the windows open, it's not just hot air that blows in.
Thank you, everybody.